a beautiful day in this neighborhood, a beautiful day for a neighbor. Would you be mine? Could you be mine? It's a neighborly day in this beauty wood, a neighborly day for a beauty. Would you be mine? Could you be mine?
I don't think I ever noticed how busy the piano was behind that before.
Johnny Costa.
It's beautiful, hey? But a lot of flourishes.
Amazing piano player. Johnny Costa was one of the great jazz pianists, a disciple of Art Tatum. And there it is.
I just thought it was Fred.
No.
No?
I mean, what's actually incredible is that during the show, Johnny Costa had a piano on the set, and he was live improvising. So all of those little flourishes happening in the middle of scenes are happening spontaneously.
He's just like an old-time silent movie.
Exactly.
Just watching it and doing it. I should point out who I'm talking to right now. We just heard the theme song to Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. You can picture him changing into one of his colorful zip-up sweaters, putting in his comfy shoes. Since 1968 and for decades after, Fred Rogers taught children how to be kind, how to be neighborly, and that they were loved just the way they were. These seemingly simple ideals moved the fellow you just heard me talking to, Morgan Neville. That's why the award-winning director made his new documentary, Won't You Be My Neighbor, all about Mr. Rogers and all about the impact of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. I have a feeling if you're listening to this right now, you have probably seen it, or at least you're aware of it. So I'm excited to talk to him about it. Morgan Neville's in the studio with me right now. So I heard this all is all inspired by Yo-Yo Ma in some strange way.
Yes, that is actually where it began. I mean, I was born in 1967, so I was like Gen 1 Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood fan.
Right.
And I loved it as a kid, loved it. And then I didn't think about him for decades. And about 7 or 8 years ago, I'd started working on a documentary with Yo-Yo Ma, and I was just getting to know him. And one day at lunch, out of the blue, I said, "How did you figure out how to be a famous person?" And
Because it's a destructive thing. It can be.
It is.
It can be a weird ego thing.
yeah, well, Fred called it the other F word, fame. But Yo-Yo, without hesitating, said, "Oh, Mr. Rogers taught me." And I kind of chuckled, and he said, "No, I'm not kidding that I went on a show multiple times, but the first time I went on a show, he recognized that I was struggling with notoriety and with being a famous person, and he really went out of his way to mentor me over years into how to use fame as a tool for positive social change and not as a weight around my neck." And my mind was kind of blown when he said that, and I think that was honestly the seed that led me to making this film all these years later.
And you said to yourself, I'm interested in what. There was more than just the man himself that you found interesting about this, obviously. There was obviously something you wanted to document in this film.
Sure. I mean, really what it came down to then, a number of these different things that got me thinking about him differently, that he wasn't, I mean, in many ways, the popular conception of Mr. Rogers is almost the definition of kind of a two-dimensional kind of milquetoast character.
Square, kinda,
guy with the cardigan,
Yeah.
and it's cute and simple and but thin. And I kept having these clues that here was somebody who had a lot more dimension to them than you think. And what it came down to is late night somehow ending up on like a YouTube deep dive watching commencement addresses that he gave. And just feeling like, oh my God, I haven't heard not only that voice, his voice, but I haven't heard anybody speak like that in a long time. Like there was just something about what he was talking about that I felt I don't hear people talk about anymore.
Yeah, because there is a real, there are documentaries made about things that were on TV and things that are now gone, or musicians that once played or musicians that are now gone, that feel like, it's an archive of the time. This, perhaps it's because of the age of crassness that we may be in right now. And I don't mean to sound some like mother hen here, but it did feel pertinent while you were watching it. Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely. I mean, when I tried to digest what Fred Rogers stood for down to like a bumper sticker, what I came up with was radical kindness. And he was a warrior for kindness. Really, he was. What he said he wanted to do was to make goodness attractive. And he said, I don't want to be thought of as quaint or naive or a Pollyanna, but that he really believed in the power of kindness, because kindness and neighborliness, I mean, really is the thing that defines what connects us. It's the rules we decide we're going to live by when we decide we're going to live in a neighborhood together. It's really the stuff that feels kind of under threat these days.
There's some really beautiful moments here that aren't things that are on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood himself. Like one of my favorite moments, which I had never seen before. This is Mr. Rogers in front of the U.S. Senate being questioned by a senator who really wanted to cut public television. In his mind, he had already cut public television. Mr. Rogers, like some folk hero, gets up in front of the microphones. We'll just take a listen to this.
I end the program by saying, you've made this day a special day by just your being you. There's no person in the whole world like you, and I like you just the way you are. And I feel that if we in public television can only make it clear that feelings are mentionable and manageable, we will have done a great service for mental health.
And the senator says something along the lines of like, well, you just got your money.
Yeah, your $20 million, Mr. Rogers. It's Mr. Rogers Goes to Washington. Absolutely.
So Morgan Neville, in making this film, what did you learn, not just about this, again, kind soul he was, but how determined he could be, how ambitious he could be?
I mean, that's the thing. He had incredible willpower. He was somebody who, and there's so many different things we don't even go into in the film. I mean, he was somebody who lived by such a strict code. He'd wake up at 5 a.m. He would read the Bible every morning in Hebrew or Greek. And he would swim a mile every day of his life.
He kept the same weight. I love
kept the
that.
same weight his whole life. I mean, and he worked incredibly hard on every one of those episodes. And essentially the thing about the show is people think of it as what he wanted was for it to be simple and deep. And the thing is, a lot of people think that simple means it's not complicated, that not a lot of thought went into it, that somehow it's superficial. And Fred's, that's where the deep part comes in, that Fred worked so hard. So even every little gesture on the show, every line of the show was something that he thought through and worked over and made come alive. So really, I think it's who Fred was, as opposed to Mr. Rogers, was not opposed to the public persona, but kind of a much deeper version of who the public persona was, just a much more complex, more intellectual, and more kind of strident Mr. Rogers.
So the show goes to air, Mr. Rogers goes on the air, and like week 1, he addresses the Vietnam War. I guess when I was watching Mr. Rogers, I missed some of the more controversial episodes of Mr. Rogers. How rare was it for children's TV to be talking about the Vietnam War and things like that at the time?
I think it was rare then. It's rare now.
Yeah.
I mean, it's rare to be talking about any of these things. So, if he starts the first week of programming talking about Vietnam and over the years ends up talking about things like death, AIDS, nuclear holocaust, I mean, incredibly complex things, assassination.
Yeah.
Nobody to this day is talking about those things. I mean, it was the only time anybody talked about those things. But what he thought was so important is that what we tend to do as adults is tell children to not worry about it. They hear about something bad happening in the world, and we say, oh, don't worry about it, and kids are way too intuitive to not worry about it. Of course they're going to worry about it. And so what he decided to do is level with kids and level with them in kind of age-appropriate language and let them know what they need to know, but don't pretend that nothing bad is happening in the world.
And he uses the king, right? He uses
So the Land of Make-Believe is basically his parable machine, where he would come up with characters who could act out then a story around whatever the theme was of that episode or that week. And, those stories are very emotional and complex, but they help kids process exactly what's going on.
And then in the parable machine that generates the Vietnam War story, again, bringing it back to right now, the king, what was the king's name again?
King Friday.
King Friday, the 13th.
The 13th, yes.
Is putting up a wall. And then peace and love and my favorite, tenderness, which is a term you don't hear anymore, takes down the wall. How perfect is that for right now?
I mean, it felt so perfect. And in fact, there were so many things like that in the old episodes that I pulled back on them just because it started to feel too heavy-handed.
Oh, yeah.
But
too didactic or something like that.
Yeah, and I feel like, this is a story that I think connects with a basic kind of humanity, that even though he was a Presbyterian minister, which we haven't said, that he he never wanted anybody to feel excluded. So he never brought up anything that would make a child feel that they couldn't take part in the neighborhood. So what he was doing was talking about basic humanist values of how we should treat each other, and even more importantly, how we should treat ourselves, and how interconnected those ideas are.
If you're a casual fan of Mr. Rogers, like I am, there are, I suppose, as opposed to these diehard Mr. Rogers fans out there, but you know what I mean. If you watched it as a beautiful show growing up, you might have missed these moments of stories about Robert F. Kennedy's assassination, episodes about the Vietnam War, and the character of Officer Francois Clemens, who you might remember was this policeman who would drop over from time to time in the neighborhood. There was this really memorable scene that you show in your film involving Mr. Rogers inviting Officer Clemens to wash his feet with him in a kid-sized pool. Take a listen to this.
Cool water on a hot day.
Well, thank you for your refreshments.
Oh, I'm glad you like it.
That's a scene from an episode of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood from 1969. I'm talking to Morgan Neville, who made a new film about Fred Rogers, about Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood called Won't You Be My Neighbor? Tell us what's happening there.
Sure. So, this is the time where, there's still segregation in the States and elsewhere, and there's still battles over whether things like pools should be integrated. And Fred, in his own quiet way, decides to bring on an African-American cast member and make him the policeman in the neighborhood. This is 1968. He brings on Francois Clemens right in the wake of Martin Luther King's assassination. And then in an instance like this, goes out of his way to have the two of them put their feet in a little kiddie pool together and cool off. And then at the end of it, Fred helps dry Francois's feet with a towel, which is not lost on anybody who kind of understands the biblical implications of that.
Well, yeah, the again, parable machine you're saying
Yes.
there, of Jesus washing the feet of Mary Magdalene and washing the feet of his disciples, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think this was Fred's kind of quiet way of saying this is okay. We can put our feet in a pool together, and it's no big deal.
And this was exceptional in 69.
It was. I mean, I think it was certainly exceptional in children's television to be doing this kind of thing. But the other thing that strikes me just listening to that is the amount of space in his show. We talk about the quietude, he loved listening. He loved quiet. He never rushed. There was this instance where he said, well, do you want to know how long a minute is, kids? Here's an egg timer. I'm going to set it, and we're just going to sit here for a minute and not talk. And they sat there for a minute, and that was a minute. You can't imagine television execs today going along with such an idea. But this is something Fred relished, this idea of taking your time. And I think how I think about it now is, now we talk about mindfulness, this idea of kind of taking a breath and being aware of what's happening in the world and what we're thinking and feeling at any moment in time. And I feel like Fred was doing mindfulness before there was a name for it, essentially trying to kind of give us space to add our own experience to what it is we're watching on the screen.
I found myself, like the people you depict in the film, wondering what was wrong with Mr. Rogers at various points in my life. You bring up a couple of times the rumors that he was a Navy SEAL, that he had murdered people, that he had tattoos. Something had to be off about Mr. Rogers, and I was looking for it. I was looking for it in your documentary, and I was wondering when you were going to get around to the dark secret of Mr. Rogers. Instead, and there was a moment where I went, Mr. Rogers, and it involved Francois Clemens, where I don't think this is giving anything away, but Officer Clemens, Francois Clemens he was a gay man. He went to a gay bar, and Mr. Rogers says, well, I don't want to see you there anymore. Please don't go there anymore. And you could tell he had to struggle there. And I was so curious about that because I also know that the Rogers estate wanted you to keep him from being depicted as a saint, as being simply perfect.
Yeah, I mean, it was Mrs. Rogers told me that when I first met with her to make the film. She said, don't make him a saint. Right. Which is kind of the best thing you can hear as a filmmaker, which is the idea that Fred was a human and that we have to understand that he struggled with these things, because somehow to sanctify Mr. Rogers is to say, well, he was good because he was that way and we don't have to try and measure up. But what you realize is that he struggled so hard with every element, not only the show, but of his faith, from the earliest days to his deathbed, wondering if he had done enough. So I think what that does is asks us as an audience to say, well, we have to struggle. We can't just say it exists on a different plane. We have to try and do the best we can do. And I think that was hugely important. And I think there were a lot of times where he had to check his politics
Really?
in service of the show, in protecting the show. Because to do a children's television show, everybody has their eyes on you, and it's a very sensitive area. If you're speaking to the children of the country, people want to know that they can trust you. And so it wasn't only in issues of homosexuality, but even in issues of war. So, for instance, when the Gulf War happened, some of the cast members became very outspoken and asked Fred to speak out against the war. And Fred was a pacifist. Fred hated war more than anything. But he wouldn't do it. And he wouldn't do it because he didn't want to feel that there would be children whose parents were fighting that war who would then see him speak out against that war and feel somehow that they didn't belong in the neighborhood. So that was his definition, as painful and kind of limiting as that was at times. I think that was the thing he tried to protect the most.
There's something really beautiful about that. I mean, I obviously he was a just lost my pencil. Obviously, he was a human, but he was I think we have a tendency to make him into this sort of God character. And even his son says something like, it's hard living with the second coming of Christ. It's a little bit hard. There's something kind of refreshing to know that he struggled like the rest of us.
Absolutely.
And of course he did.
Of course he did. And, I find that really helpful. And it's kind of what I wanted the film to leave people thinking about. I mean, there's this question, who's the new Mr. Rogers? Who's the next Mr. Rogers? There is no other Mr. Rogers, and there never will be. And we can't theorize about what he would or wouldn't have done because he's not around. I think the question is, what part of Mr. Rogers exists in all of us who grew up with him? And if we can be in touch with those things he taught us, those basic values, then that is his legacy. We're all the next Mr. Rogers.
I tell you what it made me think of is the idea that at one point all of the children of North America were watching this show on public television. And I was on a plane yesterday and every kid had a different iPad and every kid was watching something different. And I was wondering whether we'd lose something by all of us not watching something at the same time. Well, and I wonder if a Mr. Rogers could exist right now.
Well, I think he couldn't exist for different reasons. I think there's a broader discussion about just the loss of media as a common meeting place.
Yeah.
I did a film called Best of Enemies with Gore Vidal and Wayne F. Buckley. And
I really love that film.
Oh, thank you. But that film, in a way, is kind of a parallel documentary to this one because it's the same time period, but it's talking about the role television has in bringing us together or dividing us.
I should point out, these were these nationally televised debates between a very well-known liberal and a very well-known conservative, sort of speaking sometimes respectfully, sometimes disrespectfully towards one another, and all of the country tuned in to watch it.
Exactly. And the ratings of that, I think, basically taught news networks that opinion is both very cheap to make but also gets good ratings because it's conflict. And I think Fred was the opposite of that. Now we exist in a culture that has found it much more profitable to make money or to even lead through divisiveness and anger than through goodness and kindness. So you have to kind of then pine and hopefully work towards trying to bring back some of that goodness because it sure feels in short supply right now.
If you're just tuning in, you're listening to Q. I'm speaking with Morgan Neville, who's directed a new documentary about Fred Rogers, a.k.a. Mr. Rogers. It's called Won't You Be My Neighbor? I don't know if it's the jet lag or something like that. I teared up like 4 or 5 times watching this film.
It's strangely emotional. I mean, I found it very emotional making the film. And even when we finished the film and I was listening back to the music and the mix, I started crying again. And I made the film.
I was going to say, because I watched it once. You had to live with it for a long time.
Although I have to say, it was the best experience I've ever had making a film.
Why?
Because I felt like I got to live in the neighborhood for a year. And not just me, everybody that worked on the film. We spent all of last year in this kind of bubble of Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. And it kind of filtered down to all of us, how we felt, how we treated each other, and kind of our state of mind. And that was really kind of hopeful. And then now taking the film out and seeing how people reacted to it and how profoundly emotional it is. I think it's because it's a chance for us to revisit a part of ourselves we haven't spent time with in a long time, which is our, I guess you'd call it inner child or earliest childhood, something we don't really think about what we were like when we were that age. So it kind of accesses some part of our own sense of innocence. And that just instantly makes you very vulnerable.
Well, yeah, I started crying at the moment where, after Robert F. Kennedy's assassinated, and he just says, what's an assassination? And for whatever reason, it's the innocence of that question. I know what an assassination is. Like I've lived through them. I know what they are. I'm familiar with them. I'm terrified of them in some ways. There was something about, I remember what it was like before I knew that existed, and I think that might be the reason.
There's also something so direct and powerful about it, too,
yeah.
that as we become adults, we put up defense mechanisms and shields to exposing ourselves emotionally. And children don't do that. They are so direct. And Fred was on that level at all times. He never wanted to hide behind language or obfuscation. He always wanted to go directly to the core of what the thing was or what the emotion was. And you have to make yourself very vulnerable to do that, and Fred did. So I think there's something in revisiting that voice that really asks you to be vulnerable, and I think that's really healing.
If you could ask Fred Rogers a question now, what would it be?
How do you keep your hope?
Yeah. I think we're all asking ourselves that.
Exactly. I mean, it's a matter of faith. Is another word for it. I mean, the concept that I think he believed in the most and that he talked about a lot was the concept of grace. Grace being the undeserved goodness bestowed upon us by God, or how we should treat each other just out of the goodness of our hearts, not because it's expected or it's a quid pro quo. He even had the Greek word for grace in his office. It was cheri, which is the root of the word charity. And so to him, that was essentially what it was about, which is you can't worry about the consequences. You can't worry about what you're going to get out of it. You just have to believe that if you do good, other people will do good.
You end the film in a really powerful way, which I had also seen in this commencement speech, which is where he asks them to take a minute to think about someone whose love and care has shaped them. This is how you choose to end the film. It is the last big cry moment of the film, only because you end up doing it yourself. I thought it would be appropriate to end this interview that way, only this is the radio, so if we go longer than, I think, 10 seconds, jazz music kicks in. That's true. I think if we go longer than 10 minutes, emergency jazz kicks in. So we only have 10 seconds.
Okay.
Want to try it?
I like that.
All right.
Yeah.
Can we get like a timer or something like that? Can you let me know? Or okay, Elaine's going to put 10 seconds on there, and she's going to let me know. Ready? Okay. I guess it doesn't really feel like enough time, but who are you thinking about?
My mom.
Yeah?
Yeah. My mom, I dedicated the movie to my mom. She passed away when I was making the movie.
I'm sorry.
And it's okay, thank you. But as I was making the film, every time we had this moment of silence, I thought about her. And she knew I was making this film. And so in some way, I also feel like this film was exactly what I needed to go through in the wake of her passing. So I have to thank Fred Rogers for that, too.
If it's any consolation, I thought about my mom, too.
That's great.
I think everyone thinks about their moms. Hey, it's so nice to meet you.
You as well.
Thank you for coming in.
Thank you.